Hi, and welcome to the Pulse Social Podcast. Today, I had the pleasure speaking to sports journalist Mark Lovell. Mark is originally from Devon, but has spent decades covering German football. He's worked for the BBC, CNN, and he used to be ESPN's Bayern Munich correspondent. I talked to Mark about how he had a very unique way into this job via the Air Force. He told me what it's like to interview famous footballers like Robert Lewandowski, and why being a live match commentator doesn't feel like work to him at all. Have a listen. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for joining us here today. Pleasure to have you.
It's great to be with you, Julius. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm hanging in there. Thank you.
Let's maybe talk about sport first and more about the beginnings of your sports journey. Do you remember what first made you fall in love with sports? Is there like a specific memory you have about that?
Well, I was lucky enough to grow up very near to a cricket pitch and a golf course. So, when we moved to Tavistock in England, which is in Devon, on Dartmoor, I was very lucky to be able to play sport from an early age. Yeah, and so, it was just normal to spend time outdoors playing sport with a ball, and it just sort of evolved from there. I was always fascinated with sport and loved playing sport, especially with a ball. I didn't like running too much, but if you put a ball anywhere near me, I was okay. Yeah, I would sort of chase it and try and hit it and do those sort of things. So I've always loved playing sport, and lucky enough to still be able to do that as well, in both professionally and in my spare time.
Great, yeah. Speaking of professionally in sports, what I thought was interesting about your biography, you then went on to do something that was, one could say, quite disconnected from sport, because you became a Russian language expert in the Royal Air Force. How did that come about? How did you get into that, and how did you enjoy it? What did you do there?
Well, it was a good question. I mean, the world was a different place back then, Julius. It was the Cold War, and well, the Russians were still causing trouble, but that's another story. I was always very good at languages, so I did A levels in French and Spanish, and I really, really enjoyed doing that. I didn't necessarily know what to do with those languages or what sort of career path to go on, but I was playing a lot of golf back then as well with older type people who had already retired from the military. And, Plymouth, is the nearest city to where I grew up. There's a lot of Royal Navy people. Plymouth has a very proud naval tradition, and, the dockyard and building ships. So I was always different, or I considered myself. I ended up joining the Air Force, and I did some aptitude tests for modern languages, and one of those were Russian. So that was something that I really, really enjoyed doing. Yeah, I loved learning languages, and I loved being paid for it. Um, the Air Force type things like shooting guns and the more discipline, that wasn't quite, I wasn't quite ready for that, but I really did enjoy learning the Russian. It was basically learning Russian 8-9 hours a day, yeah, and being tested regularly. Obviously it was I can't talk too much about it, but it was this very specific type of Russian. We were all sent to Berlin and started in the early 90s. So yeah, it's been a while. I think the first time I moved to Germany was in 1990, just after the war had fallen, and we were heading towards German reunification. So yeah,
Very different time, definitely, yeah.
yeah, exciting
Speaking of
times.
German unification and that whole story, did you learn German while you were on assignment in Berlin, or did you?
That that wasn't really encouraged, because we were sort of encouraged to concentrate more on our Russian. So, obviously you're young men and living in Berlin, and you, you tend to go out and try and explore Berlin, let's put it that way. And it was inevitable that I would come into contact with the German language, but I didn't have space in my head for it, to really, you know, the job was so much concentrated on Russian that it wasn't really encouraged to, bother too much with the German. So that happened after.
When you say that happened after, how did the whole learning German come about, and how did that connect to German football?
Well, I spent 7 years almost 7 years with the Royal Air Force and doing the Russian thing. And then it was time to do something different because, I was happy to move on to something different. So I decided to retrain as a journalist down in Cornwall, where I come from. So I studied newspaper journalism. Life rich tapestry happens. I met a German girl during the course and ended up moving to Munich. I didn't take a job as a newspaper journalist. I had offers, but I ended up moving to Munich in 1997 because, you know, that was that wasn't the sensible thing to do. So
But
I did
you
it.
but you still did it. So while living in Germany, you say you played yourself a bit. How was your first kind of interaction with German football?
Well, initially it wasn't very good because my brother's team was Leeds United and they lost to Bayern Munich in 1975 European Cup final, which we could talk about another time. So, yeah, he never really sort of, the Bundesliga. I remember growing up with Kevin Keegan, who was the big English star at the time. I remember him playing for Hamburg, HSV, and sort of, I used to be fascinated with football, not just German football though. That really kicked in when I moved to Germany, and I've always been for the underdog. So I would go and watch 1860 and things like that. 1860 Munich, because Bayern are already successful enough. They don't need another fan like me. So I would concentrate on the underdog. And this was when 1860, they started off playing, they were playing in Olympia Stadium then, and they were a good side. They were in the first division. They actually, 2001, they qualified for the Champions League and they lost to Leeds in a playoff. And Leeds went on to reach the semi-finals that year. So it's been a bit sad to see how 1860 have suffered the last few years. So I'm hoping for better days now that they've re-signed a couple of old stars, Kevin Folland, one of them, Niederlechner. So hope they do well.
Definitely, yeah. As a Bayern Munich fan, I can't quite subscribe to hoping that they're going to do well, but it's definitely quite sad to see how they've kind of had a demise from those early days. Of course, they still talk about those Champions League days quite a lot. But speaking about the fans, maybe a little bit, what to you comparing, English football culture and German football culture? What are the biggest differences for you when it comes to fans and the way people support their clubs?
I think I enjoy that Germany has this 50+1 rule, that not one individual can really take over a club and ruin it, basically. I think that there's more of a tendency, Julius, in Germany for the fans to be listened to. They have a voice. They are there. They create the atmosphere. And, when it's all going in the right direction for a club, the fans are totally invested and really making a great atmosphere. It's a great thing to see. The fans are listened to, even at Bayern Munich. The Bayern Munich were criticized for their yes, their dealings with Qatar, I think it was, and
Hmm.
and the fans played a part in that being removed. So that's unlikely to happen, or unlikely. That's not going to happen in England because we don't have that system. We don't have that culture. The fans are still the main currency in Germany, I would say. Um, there are voices to remove the 50+1 rule, but it's not happening. It probably won't happen in my lifetime. You'll have to follow that up, Julius.
Yeah, I hope I never have to. But maybe talking about, as you say, still it might change in the future that someone might abolish the 50+1 rule. In the time you've covered German football, which has been a pretty big amount of time, how would you say it's changed? And would you say it's changed for better or for worse?
Well, those clubs like Hoffenheim and Leverkusen and Leipzig in particular, those are probably, the three most disliked clubs in Germany,
Mm,
by the normal fan because of, they have been treated differently. They have been treated differently. I mean, Leipzig is a totally, a special case. There are arguments that they shouldn't been allowed to do what they have done. But it's far too late to discuss that now. They're an established Champions League club, and yeah, that's what money does. You know, I would say that German football has not been ruined by money, though. Whereas in England, it dominates everything. It dominates everything. So, um, yeah, it's evolved. German football has evolved. It's still very fan friendly compared to England, where I grew up. So, but you know, if you stand still, though, you're in danger of being left behind. So I think that's why, there are moves to sort of change it up a little bit, even in Germany. Whether that's a good thing, which that remains to be seen. I doubt it. Where there's money and greed involved, it generally doesn't work out. But you know what the Premier League has done well, they've marketed the league so well globally over a long period of time. Obviously, the English language has it is the world language, so it's easier to market, in my opinion. But they've done such a good job to spread the gospel, the Premier League gospel, all around the world. And Germany were late to do that.
mm,
They were late to do that. You know, they they're catching up now and they're doing a better job, but they missed the boat a little bit. And there were a few years where just the Premier League ruled everything. And I think that, the DFL, which is the company that run the Bundesliga, they're doing a better job now. And they're concentrating more on English language output and marketing for sure. It helps to have a global star like Harry Kane involved,
mm.
to say that this is a great league and look at Harry Kane and look at Bayern Munich. So that's one thing. That's the Bundesliga has always been able to attract stars from all over the world. It's how about putting that in the right package to sell it to fans all over the world.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot going to be happening in the next few years, I think, when it comes to that kind of marketing and expanding globally. Because, as you
Mm.
say, the Premier League still has so much more of a kind of outreach, especially in Asia and in the US. It's quite significant. Yeah. But speaking of players like Harry Kane, I'm not sure if you've interviewed Harry Kane. I didn't find anything about that, but you've interviewed countless other big German or big footballers who play in Germany. You've interviewed Robert Lewandowski, you've interviewed Philipp Lahm, so these like kind of legends of German football. Um, because sometimes we, as the normal viewers, see footballer interviews where it gets heated quite quickly, especially those post-match interviews. What for you, as someone who's interviewed loads of amazing players, is the key to a successful football interview? What would you say?
Well, I was lucky to be at Harry Kane's introductory press conference where he kindly, or Bayern, laid on fish and chips, which was nice. I'd missed that. And yeah, Philip Lahm, I've done Lewandowski. You just have to try and be prepared. And not everything's going to be, laid on a plate for you. Just got to try and do your preparation and you know, you need a bit of luck in life. Things are not always going to go to plan. Things are going to, go out of shape very quickly. Sometimes you're going to be running late, or he only has 2 minutes. So you have to sort of prioritize questions. These players are very much in demand. Philip Lamb's a really, really nice guy. And Lewandowski talked a little bit about, he might have ended up joining Blackburn.
Oh
but
yeah,
for
right. Yeah.
a volcano outbreak in Iceland, I think it
Mm.
was. So there was, these are interesting stories which you try and have to, try and tell. That you hope that you have the time to ask your right questions, but sometimes you just got to keep it short because there's always someone behind you or ahead of you. You've just got to. There's a one thing, PPPPP, prior preparation prevents poor performance.
Mm. Definitely, yeah. What would you say, because you've mentioned the Lewandowski interview, for example, and Philip Lahm as well, is the interview you look on back on most fondly in terms of what you would say, yeah, this is something I'm going to tell my grandkids about. I interviewed this player.
I think Lewandowski was good because he was just he's a very understated guy, but he's turned out to be one of the biggest strikers of his generation. He should have won a Ballon d'Or, that's for sure. But Philip Lahm was equally nice. Um, you know, he retired at the top, winning the World Cup, and thanks very much. That's the way to go. I wish I could have done that.
Yeah, but you're obviously not retired yet at all. And speaking of another thing you do, you don't just do interviews, obviously, you're also a live commentator, which I thought was super interesting from a, fan perspective, because we also always just listen to live commentators, and I've never kind of questioned what that's like. What do you enjoy about that work, and what's the best thing for you to be about being a live commentator? What fascinates you about it?
The best thing about being a live match commentator, it doesn't feel like work. It just feels like you're fun, but you still have to do your preparation. So I'm only comfortable doing doing the commentary when I know I've done my preparation. Everything's in front of me, and I can see my stats, and everything's there in front of me. And then, I'm prepared for whatever might happen in the game. And you know, there's a good team behind me. The production stuff and all that. So then it puts you in the right position to have some fun during the game. It definitely doesn't feel like work when you're well prepared. You're in the night, in the Allianz Arena behind me in the background, and there's 75,000 fans, and you're there with your headphones on and watching a few goals go in, hopefully. And yeah, it definitely doesn't feel like work. I would like to do more of that if anyone's listening.
What would you say? Because you spoke about, 70,000 people in the Allianz Arena and goals going in and stuff like that. What's the best game you've ever been a commentator for? Could you point your finger to that, or is every single one just kind of unique in its own way?
I'm going to revert back to another interview I've done. You're only as good as your last game. So my best game was my last one. And that was Bayern against Leverkusen, I think, in the Champions League. Yeah, that was my last game in the stadium. Bayern were too good for Leverkusen in those two games, that's for sure. So yeah, when you're a freelance anything, you're only as good as your last job. Yeah. I gave another interview for the German Sports Association a while back. It feels like sometimes it's like London buses. You wait around for about what feels like 3 weeks, and then 2 or 3 London buses turn up at the same time, those red buses. So I'm hoping that will be the case, especially now with AI. I mean, AI might be considered that you are saving time, but you are cutting corners a lot of the time. You need to fact check, as any journalist, you need to check everything because it can come back and bite you very, very quickly. So that's my only advice to anyone. AI is a great thing, absolutely great thing, but you still need to do your basics, preparation, and check everything. Get someone to check it through like it was your last will and testament.
Would you say, speaking about AI and those kind of tools, a lot of people are saying, especially people who aren't in the journalism industry, that over the long run, AI is going to replace, especially sports journalists and football journalists. Do you believe that that's actually going to happen?
Well, I can feel it happening at the moment to me. That's why we're going on about those London buses. But, I'm realistic. I've reached a certain age, and maybe the opportunities are not so, available at the moment, but I've just got to keep on going. I can't afford to think too negatively. I've just got to keep on going. Winston Churchill, you won't remember Winston Churchill. You've probably heard of the name.
Definitely, yeah, of
He
course.
said, if you're going through hell, keep going. So that's my only advice.
Thank you very, very much for joining us here today. It's been a real pleasure.
No, absolute pleasure, Julius. All the best with everything, and stay in touch.
All the best. Thank you.